It was an ordinary morning in Redding, California, a quiet town where neighbors knew each other by name, and life moved at a slow, comforting pace. The sun had just risen over the rolling hills, and the streets were filled with the usual bustle of parents dropping their children at school, commuters heading to work, and dogs being walked along familiar sidewalks. Among the town's many families, one stood out not for wealth or notoriety, but for its image of perfection. Sherri Papini, a devoted mother of two, and her husband Keith. Sherri's life seemed enviable to anyone looking from the outside. She was the kind of mother who coordinated playdates with precision, baked treats for school events, and managed a household with apparent ease. Friends described her as cheerful, energetic, and endlessly caring, the embodiment of the supermom. In a town like Redding, where community ties ran deep, Sherri was admired, respected, and considered a pillar of family values. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, something extraordinary was about to shatter the quietude of Redding. On November 2nd, 2016, Sherri Papini disappeared without a trace. A simple errand that should have taken only a few hours would spiral into a case that riveted the nation, perplexed investigators, and ultimately revealed a story far stranger than anyone could have imagined. The discovery of her abandoned belongings, a cell phone tangled in earbuds, strands of her hair scattered along a rural road, suggested a violent abduction. Fear gripped the community. How could a seemingly ordinary woman vanish so completely in a small, familiar town? Within hours, the search expanded beyond Redding, drawing volunteers, law enforcement, and media attention from across the country. For weeks, the world watched. Posters were printed. Social media campaigns flourished. News outlets broadcast every detail of the investigation. Every tip, no matter how small, was scrutinized. Families prayed. Children wondered if their mother would return. And all the while, the question lingered. Who could commit such a crime in a place where everyone thought they knew their neighbors? What began as a heart-wrenching story of a missing mother would soon twist into something far more complex. The shocking events that followed, the inconsistencies in her story, and the unraveling of a fabricated narrative would leave the community and the nation questioning everything they thought they knew about Sherri Papini. The case would become a cautionary tale, a dramatic reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that sometimes the truth is far stranger than fiction. Before the storm of headlines and investigations, before the shocking news of her disappearance, Sherri Papini lived a life that seemed, to outsiders, nothing short of idyllic. In the suburban neighborhoods of Redding, California, she and her husband Keith presented the picture of a happy, devoted family. 2 children, a cozy home, and a carefully curated daily routine painted the portrait of domestic perfection. Friends and neighbors often described Sherri as warm, friendly, and endlessly attentive, the kind of mother who seemed to have boundless energy and patience. Sherri's mornings were a symphony of precision. Wake the children, prepare breakfast, check school bags, kiss her husband goodbye, and ensure everyone left the house on time. By mid-morning, she was often running errands, volunteering at school events, or coordinating playdates. To those who watched her, Sherri appeared to have mastered the delicate balance between parenthood, community involvement, and personal care. She had a presence that drew people and a smile that seemed effortless, and an aura of calm confidence that reassured everyone around her. Yet, even in lives that seem perfect, small fissures often run beneath the surface. While Sherri projected composure, those closest to her knew little of her private struggles. Married life, parenting, and personal expectations are never without friction. And though the Papinis were considered a model family, their story would reveal the pressures and complexities that can hide behind a carefully maintained facade. Sherri's social media presence mirrored the life she presented to her community. Photographs of her children laughing, images of family outings, and cheerful posts created an impression of happiness and order. To her friends, she was the epitome of dedication and charm. To strangers, she seemed untouchable, the perfect mother and wife, admired for her commitment, patience, and energy. It was within this context of perceived perfection that the events of November 2nd, 2016 would unfold. On that day, no one could have anticipated the dramatic rupture that would tear through her carefully constructed life. In an instant, the mother, wife, and community figure they thought they knew would vanish, leaving behind fear, confusion, and a haunting question: what had really happened to Sherri Papini? As investigators would soon learn, the answers were far from simple. And as the nation prepared to watch her story unfold on news screens and social media feeds, one thing became clear. The reality of Sherri Papini's life and her disappearance would be stranger than anyone could have imagined. November 2nd, 2016 began like any other day in Redding, California. The town's streets were quiet, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of pine and dry leaves. For Sherri Papini, it should have been a routine morning, a quick errand, a stop at the store, and then back to the familiarity of her home and family. But that ordinary day would spiral into a national spectacle, leaving a community shaken and the country asking a single, haunting question: where had she gone? Sherri left her home, allegedly to pick up a few groceries. Yet when the hours stretched on and she did not return, her absence immediately raised concern. Keith Papini, her husband, tried calling her phone repeatedly, but it went unanswered. The routine that had always seemed so ordinary suddenly carried a weight of dread. Something was wrong. When authorities arrived at the scene, they found her belongings abandoned along a rural road. Her cell phone tangled in earbuds, strands of blonde hair strewn across the pavement. The evidence suggested a sudden struggle, a violent abduction. Search efforts began immediately. Law enforcement teams, volunteers, and neighbors combed the surrounding areas, calling out for any sign of her. Helicopters hovered overhead. Drones scanned the sprawling landscape. Every trail, every wooded path, every highway exit became a potential lead. News of her disappearance spread rapidly. Local television stations broadcast her photo with urgent appeals for information, while social media channels became flooded with messages of concern. Strangers from across the country began sharing her story, hoping to aid in her safe return. Posters were printed, neighborhoods were canvassed, and the town of Redding held its collective breath. The narrative that captivated the nation was simple, yet horrifying. A young mother, devoted to her children, had been violently taken from her community. For weeks, hope and fear intertwined in the hearts of those watching. Volunteers scoured the terrain tirelessly, families offered support, and investigators pursued every lead. Every tip mattered. Every clue became a potential breakthrough. As the search continued, the media amplified the story. Headlines described Sherri as a missing mother and supermom abducted in broad daylight. Celebrities, journalists, and everyday citizens alike expressed shock and sympathy. GoFundMe campaigns were launched to support the family, offering donations to aid in her search. The story became emblematic of parental fear, community solidarity, and the chilling reality of random acts of violence. But even as the search intensified, certain details began to puzzle investigators. Some witness reports were inconsistent. Some leads proved false. Yet for the Papini family and the community, the focus remained singular: finding Sherri alive and bringing her safely home. The nation watched as her disappearance grew from a local mystery into a story of suspense, one that would soon take an unexpected and shocking turn. Days turned into weeks, and the hope that sustained the community showed no sign of fading. Flyers adorned every public space, volunteers doubled their efforts, and law enforcement continued to pursue every possibility. Then, on Thanksgiving morning, nearly 3 weeks after she vanished, a miracle, or so it seemed, occurred. Sherri Papini was found alive, wandering along a highway in Northern California. Emaciated, bruised, her long blonde hair cut short, and shackled with makeshift restraints, she told a story that would captivate the world. She had been kidnapped by 2 masked Hispanic women and held captive in a remote location. The narrative was horrifying, yet inspiring, a tale of survival against unimaginable odds. Her rescue was hailed as a triumph, a testament to resilience and hope. For the first time, the nation could breathe again. Vigils were held. Messages of relief and encouragement poured in. The story seemed complete. A missing mother had been found and returned safely to her family. But beneath the relief, cracks were beginning to form, subtle, almost imperceptible hints that Sherri's story might not be what it seemed. And these cracks would soon widen, revealing a truth that was far stranger than anyone could have imagined. The morning of Thanksgiving, 2016, brought what many believed was a miracle. Sherri Papini was found wandering along a rural highway in Northern California, battered, exhausted, and traumatized. News of her return spread like wildfire, igniting a wave of relief and jubilation across Redding and the entire nation. For nearly 3 weeks, families, neighbors, and strangers alike had clung to hope, praying for her safe return. Now, finally, it seemed that hope had been rewarded. Sherri's appearance was shocking. Her once-long blonde hair had been cut short, bruises marked her arms and legs, and her clothing was torn and soiled. Makeshift restraints, chains, and signs of malnourishment suggested a harrowing ordeal. In her initial statements, she described being abducted by 2 Hispanic women who had forcibly held her in a remote location. They had allegedly kept her in captivity, blindfolded, and under constant threat of violence. The details she provided were horrifying. She had been moved multiple times, forced to eat minimal food, and threatened with a gun. She spoke of fears so intense that every moment seemed a battle for survival. Authorities, along with forensic teams, treated her account with utmost seriousness, combing the surrounding areas for evidence of her captors and possible hideouts. The nation held its breath as investigators followed every lead. Media outlets quickly seized on the story. Headlines described her as a courageous survivor, a mother who endured unimaginable terror, and a figure who had emerged from a nightmare. Social media campaigns surged. Celebrities and news personalities amplified her story, highlighting the ordeal of parents facing the unthinkable. Sherri was hailed as a symbol of resilience, and her family was enveloped in an outpouring of sympathy and support. Yet, even in the midst of widespread relief, investigators began to notice small inconsistencies. The narrative of abduction, while dramatic, contained gaps. Locations described by Sherri did not always match known geography, and certain timelines raised questions. Physical evidence that would typically accompany such a violent abduction, tire tracks, footprints, DNA traces, was minimal or absent. Some experts suggested that the trauma she described did not align with her physical condition. Despite these early suspicions, the public largely accepted her story at face value. To many, the image of a mother returned safely after weeks of terror was enough. Donations flooded in to support the family. Community members held vigils and expressed gratitude for her return. Sherri appeared to be on the path to recovery, both physically and emotionally, while authorities quietly continued to investigate the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. The juxtaposition of relief and doubt created a complex atmosphere. On the one hand, there was joy. A mother returned to her children, alive against all odds. On the other hand, subtle questions lingered in the background, like shadows in the corners of a room. Had something about her story been overlooked? Were there elements of the abduction that did not fully add up? As days passed, investigators intensified their scrutiny. Interviews with Sherri were conducted, phone records examined, and surveillance footage reviewed. Slowly, a narrative began to emerge, one that would challenge everything the public had believed. Beneath the veneer of trauma and survival, pieces of a far stranger puzzle were beginning to appear. Sherri Papini's return was meant to mark the end of a terrifying ordeal. Instead, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would reveal deception, manipulation, and an elaborate web of lies that shook her community to its core. The world had celebrated her survival, but the real story was only just beginning to unfold. In the days and weeks following Sherri Papini's dramatic return, investigators began to notice inconsistencies that could not be ignored. At first, the public remained captivated by her story, a mother who had survived an unimaginable ordeal. But for detectives and federal agents, the case was far from closed. What had initially seemed like a straightforward abduction began to unravel under careful scrutiny. One of the first red flags came from surveillance footage and geographic inconsistencies. Sherri had described being held in remote locations, constantly on the move, yet there were gaps in her story about travel times and distances. Certain areas she claimed to have been confined and did not match the physical evidence investigators could verify. Experts began asking pointed questions about her injuries. Some appeared superficial, others inconsistent with prolonged captivity. Phone records revealed additional anomalies. Sherri's phone, which she had claimed was destroyed or discarded during the abduction, showed activity inconsistent with her account. Investigators noted periods where her location and communication did not align with her alleged timeline of captivity. While these discrepancies were subtle at first, they were enough to warrant further scrutiny. Moreover, forensic evidence raised doubts. DNA samples collected from the roadside where her belongings were found failed to match any unknown individuals, and the physical environment offered few signs of a prolonged struggle. Chains and restraints that should have been difficult to remove appeared to have been manipulated in ways experts found unusual. Detectives began exploring alternative scenarios. Could Sherri have been somewhere else entirely during her disappearance? Could her injuries have been self-inflicted or staged? The investigation shifted from searching for external perpetrators to understanding the possibility of deception. It was an uncomfortable turn questioning a mother who had supposedly endured horrific trauma, but the evidence demanded it. Interviews with family, friends, and acquaintances revealed additional complexities. While Sherri was widely admired, her personal life was not as transparent as it appeared. Past relationships, personal stressors, and patterns of behavior were examined for potential links to her disappearance. Investigators pieced together a timeline that did not fully match her public statements. As the truth began to emerge, the investigators were faced with a challenging task: how to reconcile the national narrative of a heroic survivor with mounting evidence that suggested her story might be fabricated. They had to proceed carefully, gathering proof before taking any action, knowing that public opinion had already rallied strongly behind Sherri. During this period, the media remained largely unaware of the growing doubts. News outlets continued to celebrate her survival, portraying her as a resilient mother and victim of a violent crime. Donations and messages of support poured in. Social media campaigns praised her courage, and the narrative of heroism persisted. Yet behind the scenes, federal agents meticulously examined each detail. Every statement Sherri had made, every photograph, every item of evidence collected during the initial search was reviewed with a critical eye. Patterns emerged that were difficult to ignore. Evidence of preparation, inconsistencies in location and timing, and anomalies in her physical condition that did not align with prolonged captivity. The deeper investigators delved, the more apparent it became that the case was not as it had first seemed. The narrative of a mass abduction, while compelling, was increasingly difficult to support with facts. Slowly, an unsettling conclusion began to form. Sherri Papini's disappearance might have been orchestrated, a carefully staged event designed to deceive the public, the media, and even law enforcement. This realization marked a pivotal shift in the investigation. What had started as a search for a missing mother now transformed into a probe into deception and fraud. Federal authorities prepared to confront one of the most bizarre and audacious cases they had encountered, one in which the line between victim and perpetrator was about to be blurred beyond recognition. The nation, still unaware of the emerging truth, remained captivated by her story. Meanwhile, the investigators worked quietly but relentlessly, following evidence wherever it led, determined to uncover the real story behind Sherri Papini's mysterious disappearance. As the investigation progressed, what had once seemed like a straightforward abduction began to reveal its true, shocking nature. Evidence, carefully collected and analyzed, pointed investigators in an entirely unexpected direction. Sherri Papini had not been kidnapped by two masked women. Instead, the reality of her disappearance was far more complicated and far more deliberate than anyone could have imagined. Federal agents discovered inconsistencies that could not be ignored. Surveillance footage, phone records, and witness accounts painted a picture that contradicted Sherri's story. Her phone, supposedly destroyed during the abduction, had been active during key periods. Locations she claimed never to have been near were confirmed as stops she had made during her disappearance. Each piece of evidence built a narrative that could no longer be reconciled with her original statements. The most damning discovery came when investigators traced her movements during the 22 days she was missing. Sherri had been staying with an ex-boyfriend nearly 600 miles away in Costa Mesa, California. Far from being held captive by strangers, she had orchestrated the entire disappearance herself. The bruises, the short hair, and the chains, all carefully staged to lend credibility to her fabricated abduction story. It was a calculated act designed to deceive not only her family but law enforcement, the media, and the public. The motive, investigators concluded, was complex. During her disappearance, Sherri had solicited donations through GoFundMe campaigns and other avenues, collecting money from well-meaning supporters who believed they were aiding a family in crisis. Her elaborate lie had tapped into national sympathy, exploiting the public's empathy for a mother supposedly in peril. The deception was not only audacious but meticulously planned, leaving behind a trail of falsehoods that required painstaking effort to untangle. Confronted with overwhelming evidence, Sherri Papini's initial denials gave way to confession. She admitted to staging her own abduction, admitting that her narrative of masked assailants was fabricated. Investigators pieced together the timeline of her movements, reconstructing the events of those 22 days in meticulous detail. From a moment she left her home under the guise of a simple errand to her return on Thanksgiving, the story of her disappearance was revealed as a carefully choreographed act of deception. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community of Redding and across the nation. People who had rallied to support her, who had followed every news report, and who had shared her story widely were forced to confront a harsh truth. They had been deceived. Friends, neighbors, and well-wishers struggled to reconcile the image of a devoted mother with the reality of deliberate fraud. The betrayal was profound, and the emotional fallout lingered long after the legal process began. Sherri Papini's case became a cautionary tale about trust, manipulation, and the power of perception. It highlighted how appearances can be meticulously curated, how public sympathy can be leveraged, and how truth can be obscured by a compelling but false narrative. The meticulous planning and execution of her deception left investigators and the public alike stunned, illustrating just how far someone could go to control the story of their own life. Eventually, the federal authorities took action. In March 2022, nearly 6 years after her disappearance, Sherri Papini was arrested and charged with making false statements and committing mail fraud related to the GoFundMe donations she had solicited. The legal proceedings drew attention from media outlets nationwide, framing the case as one of the most bizarre and audacious fabrications in recent memory. In September 2022, Sherri was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. The verdict was met with a mix of relief and outrage. Justice had been served, yet the emotional and financial damage caused by her deception could not be undone. The story, once celebrated as one of survival and resilience, had become a stark warning about the dangers of manipulation, the fragility of trust, and the complexities of human behavior. Sherri Papini's tale stands as a chilling reminder that reality is not always what it seems. Her disappearance, which captivated a nation and inspired prayers, donations, and support, was ultimately a story of deceit. It demonstrated how appearances can mask intentions, how carefully constructed lies can captivate and mislead, and how the pursuit of truth requires diligence, patience, and unwavering skepticism. The case remains a study in human psychology, media influence, and investigative persistence. It is a story that will be remembered not for heroism or abduction, but for the extraordinary lengths one person went to fabricate an alternate reality, a reality that, for weeks, fooled a nation. The arrest and sentencing of Sherri Papini marked the end of a bizarre chapter in the story of a mother whose disappearance had captivated an entire nation. Yet the consequences of her deception extended far beyond the courtroom. For her family, community, and the countless strangers who had offered support, the aftermath was a tangled web of betrayal, disbelief, and lingering questions about trust, empathy, and perception. Keith Papini, her husband, faced a complex emotional landscape. He had reported his wife missing in good faith, participated in every search effort, and endured the public scrutiny that accompanied such a high-profile case. Friends and neighbors offered sympathy and encouragement, but many also struggled to reconcile their admiration with the revelation that Sherri's story had been fabricated. For Keith and their children, the journey toward understanding and healing was fraught with emotional strain. Trust, once shattered, is never easily restored. The broader community of Reading, which had mobilized in a remarkable show of solidarity, also felt the sting of deception. Volunteers who had scoured forests, rural roads, and neighborhoods to find Sherri now realized that their labor, hope, and concern had been manipulated. Fundraisers, vigils, and public campaigns, all fueled by the belief in a mother in peril, had been built on a foundation of lies. The emotional toll was palpable, and for many, it left a sense of vulnerability. If someone could orchestrate such a complex ruse, what else might appearances conceal? Nationally, the story shifted from one of survival to one of fraud, generating headlines that combined astonishment with moral outrage. News outlets recounted the full timeline of Sherri's disappearance, the gaps in her story, the meticulous investigation, and the final confirmation that the abduction had been staged. The narrative became a case study in public manipulation, the dangers of assumption, and the power of carefully curated narratives to shape perception. The legal outcome, while decisive, could not undo the consequences. Sherri Papini's 18-month federal sentence served as punishment for her crimes, but it also symbolized a broader lesson about accountability, justice, and truth. The case reinforced the importance of critical thinking, vigilance, and the careful evaluation of evidence, both for law enforcement and the public. It also underscored the delicate balance between empathy and skepticism, demonstrating how easily the former can be exploited when the latter is absent. For many, the Papini case remains a cautionary tale. It illustrates the human capacity for deception, the persuasive power of narrative, and the complex interplay between individual actions and societal response. It is a reminder that even in small towns, among familiar faces and tight-knit communities, appearances can be deceiving, and reality may hide behind layers of fabrication. Psychologists and criminologists analyzing the case noted the meticulous planning required for such a deception. From the placement of personal items along the roadside to the staged injuries and carefully constructed narrative of abduction, Sherri Papini's actions demonstrated a level of premeditation that challenged conventional understanding of similar cases. The interplay of psychological factors, personal motivation, and opportunity created a scenario that continues to intrigue experts and the public alike. Ultimately, the story of Sherri Papini leaves a lasting impression, not for heroism or courage, but for the audacity of deception and the consequences that follow. Her disappearance, once a tale of hope and community action, became a narrative about the fragility of trust and the need for careful scrutiny, even in situations that seem straightforward. It is a story that continues to resonate because it reflects the dual nature of human perception, the desire to believe and the necessity of questioning. As the dust settled, Reading returned to its quiet routines. Families resumed their daily lives, neighbors continued their familiar interactions, and the media moved on to news stories. Yet the memory of Sherri Papini's disappearance lingers, a reminder of how far-reaching the impact of a single deception can be. It serves as a modern parable about vigilance, empathy, and the enduring quest for truth in a world where appearances are often carefully curated and nothing is ever as simple as it seems. In the end, the tale of Sherri Papini is more than a story about a missing mother. It is a study in human behavior, media influence, and the power of narrative to manipulate perception. It is a case that challenges assumptions, provokes reflection, and underscores the importance of seeking truth, even when it is hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. And perhaps most importantly, it is a reminder that while miracles can happen, the reality of human actions is often far more complex and far less comforting than anyone could have imagined. The case of Sherri Papini is a story that defies expectations. What began as a terrifying disappearance, a mother lost and feared abducted, evolved into a shocking tale of deceit and manipulation. For weeks, an entire community and a nation rallied behind a narrative that was meticulously fabricated, illustrating just how easily appearances can deceive and how carefully constructed lies can captivate the public. Sherri's actions left a trail of emotional, social, and financial consequences. Friends, neighbors, and strangers alike were drawn into a story of empathy and hope, only to discover the truth was far more unsettling. The fallout serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of trust and the need for critical thinking, even in situations that evoke the strongest emotions. Yet beyond the shock and betrayal, the Papini case also highlights the perseverance and diligence of investigators. Federal agents, detectives, and forensic teams worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, demonstrating the importance of methodical investigation and evidence-based conclusions. Their work ensured that justice, though delayed, was ultimately served. In the end, the tale of Sherri Papini stands as a cautionary lesson. The line between victim and perpetrator is not always clear, and reality is often stranger than fiction. It reminds us that human behavior can be unpredictable, appearances can be misleading, and truth requires careful scrutiny. As we reflect on this case, it is a call to remain vigilant, to question narratives, and to seek facts before forming conclusions. And while the story may shock and surprise, it is also a testament to the resilience of communities, the importance of investigative persistence, and the enduring power of truth in a world where deception can sometimes seem all too easy. The disappearance and deception of Sherri Papini will be remembered not just as a crime story, but as a story of caution, curiosity, and the complex nature of human behavior. If you were captivated by Sherri Papini's story, don't stop here. Subscribe to Shadows of Crime for more chilling tales of mystery, deceit, and investigation. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew. Comment below with your thoughts. Who else has a story that shocked you to the core? Join our community of true crime explorers and dive into the shadows with us.